we'll get rolling. All right. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this very momentous day. It's the culmination of many, many months and lots of hard work by so many people, many of which are on this call. My name is Gwen Corrigan. I am the Director of Communications at Conservation Biology Institute. And before we get going, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. We have allotted approximately 30 minutes, we think, for a question and answer period. If you can hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation, and then you'll have a couple of options of how you can ask the question. You can either type it into the Zoom chat box, or you can virtually raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question in real time. I also, want to introduce our speakers from the Bureau of Land Management, who was the funder of this amazing project. James Gannon, who's a fire and fuels specialist. He'll be speaking here at the beginning to give us a little bit of background. And from the RCHCA, we have Princess Hester, who's been our fearless leader throughout the project. She is the Director of Administration with the RCHCA. And we also have Brian Shomo, who is the Director of Natural Resources with the RCHCA. From the US Fish and Wildlife Service, we have Brendan Himmelwright, who's a fish and wildlife biologist. And from CBI, we have Dr. Wayne Spencer, who's Chief Scientist at CBI and has been the science lead on this project. And Deanne DiPietro, who's been the project manager and had to juggle quite a lot for this project. All right. So just as a quick background for the entire presentation, so Princess and James are going to provide background on the partners. There are many partners. There's quite a lot of stakeholder engagement. And they will also discuss the need, or why there's a need for a range-wide approach for SKR. Actually, that will be Brendan. Then Wayne and Deanne are going to walk us through the plan overview and share some highlights with us. And Princess will describe the SKR adaptive management cycle. Then Brian will take us through an example scenario to further illustrate how the adaptive management cycle will work for SKR. Then we'll sort of round out with Wayne and Deanne talking about next steps for the plan, the implementation of the plan, and we'll also discuss recommendations going forward. And again, we'll have that time for question and answer at the end of this presentation, which should last about 45 minutes to an hour. And with that, I want to hand it over to James Gannon and Princess Hester. Take it away, James.
Hello, I'm James Gannon, Fuels Program Manager with Bureau of Land Management. And a year and a half or so ago, we had the opportunity to partner with the Department of Defense under the Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Initiative to identify listed species that occur both on BLM managed public lands and military reservations, which BLM could aid in the potential recovery of by implementing various management actions. Purpose of the partnership was to develop and promote effective ecosystem and species conservation and recovery initiatives. And one of the species whose recovery would provide increased flexibility for military missions is the Stephens Kangaroo Rat, which occurs on a few different military reservations throughout its range. BLM, Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency, or RCHCA, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service discussed opportunities and needs to move the species closer to recovery. The BLM then contracted with the RCHCA under the Good Neighbor Authority, who in turn subcontracted with the Conservation Biology Institute to support the planning and implementation of a range-wide effort to manage for SKR and protect and enhance its habitat. So we came up with 6 main tasks to help recover the species, and those were to develop a range-wide management plan, plan and implement SKR monitoring range-wide, and include DNA sampling, assess and manage unauthorized activities or trespass that impact SKR, manage SKR habitat, so vegetation management type work, complete outreach and education, and manage invasive vegetation. So those are what we are reporting on today, the culmination of that contract.
Thank you, James. Again, my name is Princess Hester. I'm the Director of Administration for the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency, and I just wanted to provide you with a little overview of what our agency is and what we do. We are a joint powers authority consisting of 10 cities in the county of Riverside, and we're responsible for implementing the Stephens Kangaroo Rat Habitat Conservation Plan. We manage over 40,000 acres of land in Western Riverside County for SKR. And this range-wide management and monitoring project that you've been a part of for the past year is a coordinated effort that takes species management to another level. This is a very innovative plan, and it will be a benefit to all of our agencies. It will standardize our processes, coordinate resources, and will provide a more accurate measurement of SKR recovery. Today, as we move along through the presentation, like Gwen said, you're going to hear from scientists who are experts in the field. And they are going to provide you with the background and detailed information specific to this range-wide plan. So thank you so much for being here. And now let's get started.
So the reason why we need a range-wide approach, it helps standardize monitoring for tracking species status, trends, and the effectiveness of management actions, which facilitates updating of any future species assessments, which improves management actions. It also helps identify any conservation actions to recover the species and how we get them implemented. Good.
So this is Deanne. I'll tell you the overview of the SKR Range-Wide Management and Monitoring Plan. It describes everything we need for managing and recovering the species at a range-wide scale. We have gathered, updated, and synthesized the latest scientific knowledge with input from species experts in an SKR working group. Many of you contributed, and we are very appreciative of your help. Based on this understanding of the status of the species over its entire range, we developed a set of range-wide conservation tools and outlined a detailed blueprint to implement coordinated range-wide species monitoring and management. Next, Wayne is going to take you through the main components of the plan. Next slide.
Okay. In order to pull off a range-wide plan with coordinated management and monitoring, we needed to produce some new technological fixes for certain issues or several scientific tasks to establish the foundations for the plan itself. The first major step, which was the first task that came out of those early meetings between the agencies, RCHCA, the wildlife agencies, BLM, et cetera, they identified the need for a range-wide habitat suitability model so that we could better track the overall distribution and abundance and quality of habitat and how it's changing with natural events as well as management interventions, and especially to track, hopefully, progress towards recovery of the populations as well as its habitat. Along the way, once we had the habitat suitability model, we created a biogeographic map. I'll illustrate that for you. And we updated the overall range-wide assessment of threats to the species by interviewing and getting answers about the day-to-day threats that the managers on reserves are facing. And then we also included on our team the San Diego Zoo Global, now the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and their great genetics staff to update our understanding of the overall population genetics and how it affects range-wide decision-making. Next. So quickly to illustrate, we created a habitat suitability model that we wanted to be quite fine-grained, but the most important thing is that it's updatable. And so we determined that using free satellite imagery from the European Space Agency was one way to do this. And so we created a novel habitat suitability map that uses traditional GIS variables like terrain, human habitation, that sort of thing, combined it with satellite imagery of variables that reflect things like the actual quality of vegetation on the ground, how green it is, how bare it is, that the sorts of things that are important to Stephens kangaroo rats, as well as soil characteristics. The good news about using this sort of imagery is that it can be updated regularly, at least annually if we want to, or even seasonally. And there's different ways with the results to map the results for different purposes. Here on the bottom, you see basically a binary suitable versus unsuitable, which might be where you need to decide that new surveys are required to discover if the species may actually be in a patch. And then at top, you see the more variable habitat quality, or the value of the habitat, where the darkest greens are likely to have the highest suitability and the highest occupancy by the species. So there's different ways to use these products, and I'll illustrate some of those next. Next. So one way is to intersect the model results with other data, such as SKR survey data. This is a very simple depiction of what we call population units, where the dark colored areas are modeled suitable habitat, where the maroon is actually occupied by SKR. There's at least one data point inside a polygon, or the pink are areas where it's unknown. They may be absent, or perhaps it's a lack of survey effort. So this is one use, and we use these sorts of tools derived from the habitat model for different tracking and decision-making through the plan. And it can be used then to track changes in habitat suitability, abundance, distribution, and overlaid on that how the population is responding. Next. So this is just a closer look in the Riverside County portion, showing those same, what we call population units. So the colored blobs are occupied areas of predicted suitable habitat, where each different color is more or less a contiguous constellation of habitat patches that are close enough together that Stephens kangaroo rats might be dispersing and interbreeding between them, whereas the different colors may be individual subpopulations or units. And so this is a useful way of tracking, again, how the habitat is fragmented and how populations may or may not be interbreeding and dispersing and moving between these habitat areas. So one of the foci of the plan is to identify where we need connectivity improvements to maybe increase the genetic and demographic variability of the populations by letting them interbreed more. So these maps are also then used to define the spatial sampling units for the trapping grids that we'll be using for occupancy monitoring. And so this year, this cursory first draft map has to be refined with some further analysis and expert input. And then it'll be used to establish the first year's monitoring sampling plots, after which it'll be continually revised as we get new data and things change. Next. I mentioned the biogeographic mapping. This is something that's available online on Databasin, and Deanne will wrap up with all of the links and things you need to access these data, make your own maps and so on. But this is an interactive map that you can go to. It kind of pulls together much of the most relevant spatial data, SKR distribution points, our habitat value maps, sliced and diced in different ways. It's a way to look at the degree of contiguity or fragmentation. What are the environmental conditions in different places? You can do your own overlays or download data sets. So it's basically a platform, a tool for sort of online collaboration and implementing the plan. Next. And then quickly, I mentioned San Diego Zoo Global, now the Wildlife Alliance. Rachel Chalk and Deborah Shire have been doing population genetics research for a number of years now on SKR throughout the range. And their information tells us things like how fragmentation is affecting SKR as a species, where we may need to improve connectivity, where populations may be inbred because they're small and isolated, and therefore the plan may call for translocations or reintroductions to help rescue populations or reestablish populations. And the plan also takes an innovative step, although we're using sort of traditional trapping, capture, recapture, for initially at least for population monitoring. With new genomics techniques, it may be possible to more directly use genetic sampling and analysis to tell us the effective population size, which is, for those biologists, it's more meaningful from a conservation planning perspective than just the census population size, because it tells you about things like genetic exchange and how inbred a population may become, that sort of thing. So all of these new unique ideas are summarized in the report, and we'll continue to build on it and hopefully move into a very regular genetic monitoring program. Next. I mentioned the threats assessment. Threats to SKR are very well documented already, but we wanted to take a little bit deeper dive on this. The range-wide threats are understood, but we did a very detailed questionnaire that many of you on this call participated in, a questionnaire for each reserve to kind of rank the nature and severity of different threats on individual reserves, which we could then roll up into another range-wide view. So reserve managers identified the key threats that are affecting populations and habitat, how they currently manage, what constraints do they face to their management. And the whole idea is to better understand the range-wide threats and how best to prioritize management, monitoring, and research actions to counter those threats or to account for them. Next. So those were kind of the new scientific advances that we incorporated into the plan. And now some of the conservation tools that are summarized in the plan. We'll walk through sort of the overall management strategy, the new monitoring strategy, a centralized database and data management strategy, so we don't have a whole bunch of different disparate GIS files in different agencies, that sort of thing. And then others will walk you through kind of an example of the adaptive management cycle and the various teams that we see coordinating this into the future. And so those are kind of the 5 main conservation tools or strategies that we're going to now walk through. Now we hand it off, right, to Brian.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Wayne. My name is Brian Shem. I'm Director of Natural Resources at the RCHCA. And just to give you guys an overview who don't know me, I lead and coordinate the RCHCA's efforts, land management and monitoring efforts, and assist with the recovery of Stephens Kangaroo Rat for our agency. One thing that became apparent in the last decade and a half or so that I've been here with the agency is that there are many management plans with individual reserves, individual areas that are conserved for Stephens Kangaroo Rat. But there's not a cohesive strategy across the region. And by region, we have geopolitical boundaries. San Diego County manages in their own way. Even within Western Riverside, we have many conservation plans and management plans and what forth. So this plan attempted to, and I think they did a really good job if you take a look at it, to summarize basically the conditions and methods for managing SKR, habitat, populations, and those threats. And it basically provides guidance for strategically planning where and when those tools that we'll talk about in the next slide might best contribute to range-wide SKR conservation goals. So essentially it lays the blueprint for building the House of Stephen, if you want to call it that. And so once we have the blueprint, we need some tools to build a house. And so next slide. It's kind of a one-stop shop. We put the manager's toolbox together. And so this is kind of a framework of all the tools that a land manager might reference in order to modify or to manage the habitat and populations and threats. And so for the habitat management, we include tools for improving habitat such as grazing and mechanical treatments, fire, various methods for soil decompactation, as well as population management. And in that toolbox, it might include information about dispersal characteristics, how to improve that dispersal, translocation, reintroduction, and genetic augmentation. Some of the threat management that might also occur in this document, we included resources for minimizing those threats, such as non-native predators, movement barriers, and excess of light, just to name a few. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Wayne to discuss some of the monitoring strategy.
Sorry, obligatory unmute faux pas. Yeah, this was perhaps one of the hardest nuts to crack. I know, and I've talked to Brian about this many, many times. There have been many attempts to kind of move towards a range-wide SKR monitoring program with standardized protocols and data collection and centralization and everything for overall range-wide assessment updates for how the population overall or how the species overall is doing. And so, and as Brian mentioned, there are many different entities that are responsible for SKR conservation management and monitoring. So to get that coordinated has been a challenge, but I think we've gotten there. So I'm going to just lay out really quickly what at the most gross level, what the sampling framework contains. And the major components. One is using that new SKR habitat model, which again can be used for a wide array of different analyses to keep track of, probably annually or at least every 5 years, how the modeled habitat value is changing on the landscape. How much high value, moderate value, or low value habitat do we have? And so we have the habitat model as sort of a top-down approach, and then there's fairly simple field evaluations of in the field conditions, and the two can be then correlated, used to improve the habitat model and used to improve insights for how things should look on the ground. And for the hardest thing is how to track the SKR population. And after going through many iterations of potential approaches, we settled on doing range-wide occupancy trapping, which is basically presence and absence trapping at a large array of sample grids. And a lot of this work is based on the work that USGS, Cheryl Bremy, Robert Fisher et al. Have done on Camp Pendleton and the Fallbrook Naval Weapons Station in developing their and testing and refining their approach. And so we based a lot of this on that, but just made it range wide. And we're going to test a similar density index to what they've applied on Camp Pendleton. And then, as I said, we're also adding a genetic diversity monitoring component, which has the potential in the future to replace some of the more time-intensive field efforts. And then there's a kind of a grab bag of ways of monitoring different threats, which we're not going to go into. It's really the habitat and the populations that are the two major prongs. Next. So the PAO monitoring strategy has to track range-wide changes in SKR status and trends. We wanted it to leverage existing efforts and not put new burden on reserve managers to the degree feasible. We want the methods to be relevant to evaluating the effects of different conservation measures and basically to inform range-wide or preserve level management decisions. And another good thing about making this range-wide and involving a wide array of agencies is the potential to really pool our resources and identify research and especially funding priorities for maybe bringing in funds to help the agencies that maybe not have a big fund for implementing some of the things they'd like to implement. That is one thing that we learned in that threats assessment questionnaire, is there's quite a few management actions reserve managers would like to do if they had the funding or a partner with the right equipment or more know-how that someone else might have. So that pooling of resources is a key thing to going range-wide. Next. So I mentioned the population monitoring occupancy approach, or percent area occupied. It's called PAO sampling for short. We use the habitat value model and we'll refine those population units. If you recall, those are occupied or potentially occupied blobs of habitat. And then sample points, a large number of sample points, the exact number yet to be determined, are randomly dropped within high value habitat areas throughout the range. And then those are trapped with standard protocols, very much like what the RCHCA is already doing and what USGS is doing on Camp Pendleton. So, and I just illustrate on the right with this table, not to wow you with numbers, but we've been using a power analysis to kind of hone in on the optimal balance between sufficient sample size of the trapping grids to answer the key questions while still balancing, you know, the realities of sampling in the field, the costs, the time, and everything else. And this just illustrates that, not to go into the numbers, but based on the probability of a grid actually being occupied and the probability of capturing a kangaroo rat on the grid, given that it's occupied, you can estimate how many sample sites you need in order to reach different levels of detection. So basically, if you want to detect a 50% change in the population, say from 1,000 to 1,500, and you don't care about smaller fluctuations than that, then you could go with the far right column on this and say, we're only interested in detecting changes of a magnitude of 50% or more. And then based on the different probabilities, you see how many grids does that require. If you want a higher level of detectability, say you think a 30% change is very significant and might trigger a change in management actions, then you need more sample points. So this, to get ahead of the game here, one of our key recommendations for the very near future is to convene our monitoring working group, our subgroup, to look at maps together, chase down what the realities are, and do further analyses to hone in on where should these plots go and how many do we really need to answer the questions in the most cost-effective way. Next. Okay, once you have all that data, you need somewhere to put it, and Deanne will tell you about that.
Thanks, Wayne. So the SKR range-wide data management strategy outlines the steps we will need to take to coordinate monitoring at the reserves and to combine that data into a single database. This range-wide monitoring database will then be used to update the habitat model, the habitat and population units, and our understanding of the species status and trends across the species range going forward. These include standards for collecting and aggregating the data based on the standardized monitoring protocols that Wayne just told you about, establishing a data manager and a centralized data portal, and offering the reserve managers tools for data collection, such as standard forms and a collector app. Okay, next slide.
And so this particular slide here is going to show you the annual adaptive management and monitoring cycle works, how the teams communicate together and share information and allow them to make the best decisions for the species across the range. As you can see with this diagram, it's a continuing cycle. So if we start with the reserve managers would collect the monitoring data and implement management actions. Information going to the data manager, who would then update the habitat suitability model and population units. Once those are updated, the technical team would update the units and sample sites range-wide, and then that information would be used and given back to the reserve manager to implement new adaptive management actions based on the data collected and the new reserves that they found. So each step in this cycle will make it possible to regularly update information about the species across this range. It's going to help determine where to monitor, how to refine your management actions and allow data to be shared. And it'll also be used to update the habitat suitability model and population units. Next slide. So in this cycle, this diagram shows how the information is collected through the annual adaptive management and monitoring cycle will be used to support the range-wide decision-making cycle. The team will use the data from the updated habitat suitability model and population units to update species status trends and then refine those recommendations for management and research. By coordinating across agencies, we can not only advise policymakers, but we can also collaboratively seek funding and provide precise data for US Fish and Wildlife and CDFW to use at the time of species status review. Next slide. So again, each of these teams consisting of the reserve managers, the technical team, data managers, and the implementation teams play an essential role in creating an open environment where this information is stored, it's shared, and it's updated based on implementation and evaluation of management actions. And as demonstrated here, one part of this cycle or one part of a team can't effectively function without the other. We all need to work together and share that information and have it ready and available in order for it to be successful. Next slide. So for range-wide coordination structure, this plan describes how we can collaborate to implement a multi-agency range-wide approach for SKR conservation. It'll involve the implementation team, technical team, data manager, reserve managers, and stakeholders. And so later on in this process, we're going to be reaching out to all of you to ask for your input on which one of these teams you'd like to be a part of so that we can continue to make sure that this project is actually implemented. And one other thing that I'd like to just add is that our model is very dynamic. So if we find flaws or areas that need revisions, we can always course correct. Next slide, please. So, okay, we'll take a pause. You've heard a lot of information so far. We've presented the background and how our program came to be. We provided you with a plan overview and some information on SKR adaptive management cycle. And so again, like Gwen said, if you have questions, please save them to the end. You can put them in the chat box, and at the end, you can use the Zoom function to raise your hand to ask your question. But right now, I'd like to turn it back over to Brian Shomore, our Director of Natural Resources, to give you some example scenarios.
Thank you, Princess. So that was a lot of information. And so from the real world perspective, let's break it down a little bit easier and a little more simplified. And so from the land manager's perspective, they're going to concentrate basically on the left side of that cycle. This graphic here represents that. And we'll start at the top with the updated habitat suitability model, which will appear on the next slide. And just before we move on, I just say a lot of us do this already. And the real goal of this was, again, to put it in the big picture. And so a lot of us do this for our own land or for our own reserves, for our own conserved areas. But that information was basically in a silo that we use for our own purposes. This plan will attempt to take that information and put it into the larger context for a higher purpose, and that is to recover the species range wide. So with that, we can move to the next slide. And we'll start with the updated habitat suitability model in the population unit. So the technical team will basically use satellite imagery every year to update the habitat suitability model and update those population units that Wayne referred to earlier. They'll then take these new maps and disseminate them to all land managers for the next round of monitoring and management that we do annually. And the next slide. So for instance, here at Lake Matthews, this would be a map that you would be given. The dark shaded green areas represent highly suitable habitat. So as a land manager, I'd want to establish my grids perhaps there, or I want to establish my management for my annual work plan in those areas going forward. And so this will be new information that is provided to each of the land managers in order for them to plan their annual work plans and their management tasks for the year. Next slide. Once those grids are established, we will continue with our monitoring. We will do live captures of SKR, and we'll take those existing grids or areas and do some habitat sampling and measure some variables, both quantitatively and maybe qualitatively, for habitat, SKR habitat. Next slide. Once we gather that monitoring data, the reserve managers then submit that data, and it's aggregated, as Deanne said, into a central database for further analysis. This would now end the annual cycle by the land managers. This information will now go into the technical team. It flows back into the technical team, which we'll see on the next slide. The technical team then, as Princess alluded to, reviews the science and the monitoring data. So they basically collect and collate all the data from all the land managers, and they give it a higher level review. They identify maybe gaps in the information. They update the status of the SKR and the trends of the population. They then, next slide, kick that over to the implementation group. And again, they go through a further analysis. And so they see where those gaps are, what research is needed, and they recommend the refinements in that management, that monitoring, and those research priorities in the overall strategy to recover the species. In addition to that, because we were very cognizant that we don't want to raise the burden too much on any one entity, for a lot of the additional stuff, the research and whatnot, this implementation group would then seek further funding to help implement their recommendations. And this would then flow back into the reserve managers, the land managers, to help solve their problems they have on the ground. Next slide. And so once that is all taken into consideration, the reserve managers would then go back to that toolbox that we discussed earlier. They can use this SKR communication portal that we're going to set up to help managers talk to each other across boundaries and within reserves in order to determine the best management strategies going forward, and hopefully raise those suitable habitats up to higher quality habitats, and those high quality habitats remain at high quality. So with that, I'm going to now turn it back over to Wayne again to discuss the plan recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So we're hoping for a seamless transition from today to tomorrow. We've now produced this document, we're making it available, but now we need to immediately start implementing it. And the first steps that I think CBI has already tasked with working with our the broader technical team to take it the next steps. We need to update our database with new information on SKR reserves and any new SKR locality data, that sort of thing. We need to sit down with the monitoring subgroup to work out how best to revise those population units and habitat units to maximize the efficiency of our PAO sampling, the trap sampling design. Once we have that detailed, then it can be implemented. And the first year of monitoring data from that feeds back into the adaptive management loop to refine the sampling methods and hopefully improve on them to make them more effective and more efficient. We also need simultaneously to populate and detail the data management system that Deanne talked about, to collect and QA, QC all of that new data that's coming in and spit out the new products. And one of our key tasks also in 2021 is to streamline the process for updating the habitat value map and all the different products that spin off of that, like the population units and the sampling units. That process of producing that model was very technically intensive and computer intensive and complicated, but we're trying to migrate it to a new system using Google Earth Engine to make it a more streamlined thing, that when the new satellite imagery come in each year, it can be processed to create the new habitat variables that can be plugged back into the habitat model to spit out new maps. So we need to streamline that so it's not such an onerous task. And then we're also recommending investigating the potential for doing some research priorities. One that we really recommend is to do spatially explicit population modeling, which is doing a population dynamic model on top of the dynamic habitat value model. So you can play what if scenarios to determine what the most effective interventions are to further recovery of the species. For example, with a population model, you can investigate whether, is it more important to improve habitat in low quality areas, or to increase the size of high quality areas, or to focus attention on better connecting those areas, that sort of thing. That part of that would also be a connectivity assessment. The population units need to be updated to consider barriers to SKR dispersal. And again, we recommend continuing to pursue the genetic analyses and try to develop better hypotheses about where SKR management interventions are necessary, such as whether some populations need genetic rescue because they're highly isolated and inbred, or if there's barriers to dispersal that need intervention to improve genetic connectivity, that sort of thing. And also to move towards hopefully genomic monitoring of gene diversity and how it is spread throughout the population, and the effective population size, which would be probably the most effective metric for the wildlife agencies to know to advance towards recovery. So we are recommending pursuing all of these things as quickly as possible. Next. Deanne.
Thanks, Wayne. Putting a link in the chat box. You can get the plan here. At this moment, it's still in its Google Doc up online, where you've been looking at it and helping us with it all these months. That is the final plan now, and RCHCA and BLM will be releasing it officially on April 5th. And at that time, you'll be able to download it from their websites and CBI's website. And CBI has also set up a database in gallery where you can get the habitat model, the biogeographic map, and other important spatial data. And the plan will be there as well on April 5th. And I will put the URL for the gallery in the chat box as well. You can go there now. There are a few resources there and more are coming. And Princess will tell you what's next for implementation.
Thanks, Ian. So what's next for implementation? There's a lot of work to do. This is really a large task that we've undertaken, and there's going to be some steps that will have to come next in order for this to be successful. We have to prepare the coordination framework. We need to convene some coordinating committees and other groups as we listed on those teams that we talked about earlier. And we need to set up our SKR communications platform. We're working to develop a platform where we can all actively communicate with different thoughts, ideas, experiences, et cetera, and be able to share them in one place so that everyone has access to them. In addition to that, there's a monitoring strategy that needs to be designed. We need to design a first year sampling plan, then implement and refine that plan based on the information we have. Then the data management strategy needs to occur by gathering the existing monitoring data that's out there. We need to identify a data manager, whether that's going to be Data Basin and Fish and Wildlife or the other wildlife agencies. We need to establish a data management standards, protocols, and tools, and then just streamline the process for updating habitat model sampling units and status updates. Like we said, we didn't want to create additional burdens of work, but we want to be able to make sure that this information is accessible and shared amongst all of the groups. Next slide. There are so many partners, all of you who participated in the development of this plan. We've been working at it for over a year. I won't list all of you, but I'd like to thank you so much for your input and taking the time, effort, and energy to support this plan. It's a rare opportunity. I'm not the scientist. I don't profess to be that. I'm definitely an administrator, but it's a rare opportunity that you get when you have a chance to develop something that you work with hands-on, and it's designed based on your input, your experience, your ideas, and information. Most of the time, we receive this information from a top-down approach. And this time, we have the opportunity to effectively design a process that really works the way that we need to use it in order to be successful. And that satisfies all of our goals, and that is SKR recovery. So I just want to say thank you for all of your support. We'll be reaching out in the weeks to come. We're going to give you a couple of weeks to digest the plan and get a chance to know it and identify information that's there that's usable. And we'll come back and we'll be asking for your commitment to implement it. Next slide. So in closing, we all manage for threatened and endangered species. And even though we may have different objectives, we have different plans, we all share that common goal, and that is to recover SKR. I believe this plan sets a new paradigm for species management. And as I started thinking about it, I'm really hoping that the wildlife agencies are able to use this approach as they continue to develop new habitat plans or NCCPs or management plans, that the collaborative approach is included in some of those governing documents that we receive. When Brian and I started with this agency, and we talked way back about the fact that we need to develop a strategy to implement a range-wide plan, at that time we kind of laughed at each other because we thought, that's impossible. Like, how is that even going to happen? And all of the reasons my government had told me that's something that's not going to work. But like many of you in your agencies, we began to just work to implement the objectives and the recovery actions that were in our draft plan to manage SKR. And now here we are. This year, RCHCA is celebrating its 25th anniversary. So we've been in this business for a long time. And today, with the experience that we've gained and the lessons that we've learned, we can actually see how this range-wide approach is possible. It may not have been possible 20 years ago, but now, because of all of this hard work, the foresight, all of our dedication and our individual agencies working together for this species, the pioneers that came before us, to just even identify the fact that this species was prevalent in our area and needed to be protected. We're all here working together. I'm very humbled to be a part of this group. And I'm really hoping that we make this plan our plan and a part of our everyday actions for species recovery. So soon, I'm looking forward to, when the idea comes up or the information comes up, Stephens Kangaroo Rat, we're like, yep, we did that. It's not just recovered, but it's thriving with the guarantee that it's going to live on forever, so that our grandkids and great-grandkids can see Stephen hop, jump, create these beautiful fields of purple lupines, poppies, and tidy tips. And so I thank you for your attention and your time today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Gwen for questions and answers.